When my mom married Tom, I didn't know what to think. At first, it was all so strange. He wasn't like the men I imagined her with, different from the kind of dad I'd always dreamed of. He was soft-spoken, more patient than I expected, with a kind smile that never seemed to reach his eyes fully, like there was something else behind it that I couldn't quite understand. I used to wonder if he was really happy or if he was just playing a part, just being the kind of person my mom needed him to be. At first, I avoided him. It wasn't that I hated him or anything, it was just awkward. He didn't have any children of his own, and I think he struggled with what he should do around me. Sometimes, when we'd have dinner, he'd talk about something he was working on, and I'd listen quietly, only offering one-word answers when I felt I should. I could tell he was trying. He was trying to be that nice guy who would eventually step into the father role, but I wasn't sure I wanted to let him. Mom was busy with her work and the adjustments of being newly married, so there were days when it felt like Tom and I were left alone together in the house. It was awkward, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. More like two people quietly observing each other from across the room, each unsure of how to fill the space between them. I noticed the little things first. How he would make me my favorite breakfast when Mom was working early, or how he'd ask me about school and seem genuinely interested in my answers. Nothing special, but it was nice. I was never used to having someone ask, and it felt strange, but not in a bad way. It wasn't until one evening, a month or so after they'd married, that I felt something different. Mom had been called in for an emergency at work, leaving just Tom and me for dinner. "Looks like it's just you and me tonight, huh?" he said, setting the table. "I think I remember you liking lasagna. Hope I didn't mess it up." I chuckled, remembering a time when he'd tried to make lasagna on his own, and it had been more of a disaster than anything edible. "I'll be the judge of that," I said, sitting down at the table, trying to hide the small smile that tugged at my lips. We ate in silence for a few moments, and then, as if realizing I had been quietly analyzing him the whole time, he said, "How's school going, by the way? I don't think we've talked about it much." It wasn't that he hadn't asked before, but there was something about the way he asked this time. It wasn't rushed or out of obligation. It felt more like he actually wanted to know. "Okay, I guess," I replied, picking at the lasagna with my fork, still unsure of how to respond. He was sitting across from me, looking at me with that same kind smile. "What's okay supposed to mean? Is everything all right?" he asked, more softly now. For a moment, I hesitated. Should I tell him about the things I was dealing with at school? The pressure to fit in? The loneliness that seemed to weigh heavier every day? Something inside me made me want to talk, even though I didn't know why. So, I did. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was really listening to me. Tom didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix anything right away. He just listened, nodding occasionally, like he understood what I was trying to say without needing to explain it all in detail. The night passed with no big revelations, but it was different. I felt lighter, somehow, like someone had seen me, truly seen me for the first time. It was small, this shift, but it was enough. Enough to make me wonder if this connection we were starting to build might become something more. Not that I expected anything out of it, but I couldn't help but feel that something was quietly changing. That evening, after dinner, as we both helped clean up, the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt easy, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And maybe that was what started it all. Over the next few months, the awkwardness that had once settled between Tom and me began to fade. It wasn't as if we were suddenly best friends or anything. It was more like we'd found a sort of rhythm. We had our quiet moments, and we had our conversations. Sometimes they were about nothing at all, but sometimes they'd venture into things that mattered. Little by little, we built a routine, an unspoken understanding that made us feel less like strangers under the same roof and more like family. He continued to make breakfast on the weekends, and I found myself looking forward to it, even if I didn't always admit it. Sometimes I'd help him peeling vegetables, setting the table, things that felt so ordinary, but for some reason felt important. When we worked together, there was a calmness in the air, like the house was somehow quieter, more peaceful when we shared these small moments. One Saturday morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my books spread out in front of me. Tom was cooking something. He was trying a new recipe. I could tell by the faint smell of garlic and something I couldn't quite place. I was so focused on my work that I didn't notice him standing nearby, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. When I looked up, he quickly shifted his attention back to the stove. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I nodded, though the truth was that I wasn't entirely sure I was. There were a lot of things on my mind: school, friends, the whole mess of being a teenager, trying to figure out who I was and where I fit in. I didn't think he would understand, so I just smiled and gave a quick, "Yeah, just busy." Tom seemed to sense the lie, though, or maybe it was just a fatherly instinct kicking in. His eyes softened, and instead of pushing me, he went back to cooking, allowing the space to linger. A few moments later, he turned and set down a plate in front of me, the warm smell of fresh toast and eggs filling the air. I wasn't sure why, but that small gesture, his quiet understanding, the way he didn't push me for more, made me feel closer to him. More than just a stepfather. More than just a man living in the house with us. It was starting to feel like something deeper. Something I hadn't expected. "Thanks," I said, picking up my fork. "This looks good." "Good. I'm glad you like it," he replied, smiling but not saying anything more. There was something in his smile, though, a kind of warmth that made me feel like he really cared, even if he didn't have all the answers. We ate in silence, the noise of the house outside this little bubble of calm. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't forced. It was just natural. But it was also more than that, and I could feel it, though I didn't quite know what to make of it. There was a growing sense of trust, of companionship in those small moments. I realized then that Tom had become someone I relied on, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to admit. Not just for the little things, like breakfast or fixing things around the house, but for the quiet comfort of knowing that he was there, without needing words to explain it. At times, I found myself wanting to talk to him more, to share the things that had been weighing on me, things I wasn't sure how to say to Mom. But when I'd open my mouth, I'd hesitate. There was always that tiny voice in the back of my head telling me to keep the distance, to not get too close. Because, after all, he was still my stepfather. And there were lines that couldn't be crossed. But no matter how much I tried to keep things at arm's length, something about him, the way he listened, the way he treated me, kept pulling me in. And so, the days passed, and I found myself spending more time around him. I noticed how easy it was to talk to him about the little things: schoolwork, random facts, the books I was reading. It wasn't deep, but it was enough. Enough to make me feel like we shared something, even if I wasn't entirely sure what it was. One evening, after dinner, when the house was quiet and Mom had gone to bed early for work, Tom and I sat in the living room. I was curled up with my book, and he was watching some documentary on TV, though I could tell he wasn't paying much attention. We were both lost in our thoughts, our small corner of silence. I couldn't help but steal a glance at him now and then, noticing how his expression softened when he thought no one was looking. It was moments like these that made me realize he wasn't just trying to be a good stepfather anymore. Somewhere along the way, I think we had become something more to each other. Something unspoken, unacknowledged, but undeniably there. I still wasn't sure how I felt about it. I didn't know where this was heading, but I knew that something had shifted between us. And that shift felt significant. It wasn't until the winter came that things began to shift in a way I hadn't anticipated. The days grew shorter, and the air outside turned crisp, but inside, the house felt warmer, more alive. Maybe it was the holidays approaching, or maybe it was just the way things had quietly changed between Tom and me, but I started to feel a sense of something more real, more tangible. Mom had been working late again, her usual hours stretched even longer as she tried to juggle the responsibilities of her job and home. And as the holiday season drew nearer, she became more distracted, more distant, leaving Tom and me alone together more often than usual. It wasn't a problem at first. In fact, I welcomed it. Our usual routine: Tom cooking, me quietly observing, both of us exchanging the occasional joke or smile, had become a comforting part of my days. But one evening, Just before Christmas, I noticed something different. Something I couldn't quite place at first, but it lingered in the air between us, like a tension that hadn't been there before. It was late, and we had just finished cleaning up after dinner. Tom was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. I was supposed to be doing my homework, but the words on the page wouldn't stay still. My mind kept wandering. I glanced over at him, watching as he absent-mindedly rubbed his forehead, the lines of exhaustion faintly visible across his face. He'd been working so hard, and I wondered if it was the stress of the holidays or something else that was wearing on him. "Tom," I said, my voice soft. "Are you okay?" He glanced up, surprised. "Yeah, just a little tired," he replied, offering a smile that seemed more strained than usual. He was trying to hide it, I could tell, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet sadness that hadn't been there before. "I can tell," I said, setting my homework aside. "You don't seem like yourself lately." He chuckled softly, the sound a little too sharp to be genuine. "It's nothing. Just the usual work stuff." I didn't press further. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I was stepping into territory I wasn't meant to explore. Even so, I couldn't help but notice how much he'd changed since that first awkward dinner we had together. The connection between us, subtle at first, had grown stronger, deeper. I could talk to him now, about things I couldn't share with anyone else, things I hadn't even shared with Mom. Still, there were things I couldn't bring myself to say. I was afraid that if I said them out loud, it would change everything. That it would break the fragile understanding we had built over time. When I looked back at Tom, he was staring out the window, his gaze distant. He hadn't noticed I was watching him. Something in the way he looked at the world beyond that window, almost longing, almost lost, stirred something in me. I felt an odd kind of empathy for him in that moment, an understanding of how lonely he must feel sometimes, even though he was surrounded by people who cared. I stood up and walked over to the couch, sitting down beside him. At first, neither of us spoke. But then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, I leaned my head on his shoulder. I didn't know why I did it. It wasn't something I had planned. It wasn't even something I had been consciously thinking about. But in that moment, it felt right. He tensed, and I could feel it, but only for a moment. His body softened after a few seconds, and he didn't pull away. I could feel the warmth of his body, the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, and it was the most peaceful I had felt in a long time. "Thanks for everything, Tom," I whispered, not sure if he heard me or not. For a long time, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, his arm gently resting against mine, neither of us breaking the silence. I could hear the sound of the clock ticking in the background, a constant reminder of time moving forward, yet in that moment, it felt like time had stopped altogether. It felt like we were in a small bubble, away from everything, away from the world, away from the uncertainties and complexities of our lives. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "You don't have to thank me for that." I wanted to say more, but I didn't. Instead, I just nodded, my eyes growing heavy as the warmth of the room settled over me. The unspoken connection between us had become stronger, more undeniable. I was beginning to realize that, in some ways, I was relying on him more than I had ever allowed myself to admit. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I knew that it wasn't just because he was my stepfather. There was something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name, let alone understand. As I drifted off to sleep on the couch beside him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something big. And I wasn't sure how to stop it. It was when winter arrived that I realized everything had begun to shift. The days grew shorter, and the outside air became cold, but inside, the house felt warmer, more alive. Maybe it was because the holidays were approaching, or maybe it was just the way things had slowly changed between Tom and me, but I started to feel something deeper, something more real. Mom had been staying late at work more often, as usual, but this time, I could feel the distance between us growing. She was distracted, absorbed in her responsibilities, leaving Tom and me alone together more than ever. It wasn't a problem at first. In fact, I even welcomed it. Our usual routine, Tom cooking, me quietly watching, Both of us sharing the occasional joke or smile had become a comfortable part of my days. But one evening, just before Christmas, I noticed something different. It wasn't that anything had changed on the surface, but there was a strange, unspoken tension in the air. A quiet weight that hadn't been there before. It was late, and we had just finished cleaning up after dinner. Tom was sitting in the living room, flipping through TV channels. I should have been doing my homework, but my mind wouldn't focus. I kept thinking about everything, about school, about Mom, about everything. I glanced over at him. He was staring out the window, his brow furrowed, as if lost in thought. The usual calm was gone, replaced by something heavier. I couldn't quite figure it out, but I could tell he was troubled. "Tom," I said, my voice quiet. "Are you okay?" He looked up, startled, and then quickly tried to mask his expression with a smile. "Yeah, just a little tired," he said, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Work's been busy." I nodded, but I could tell it was more than that. There was something in the way he spoke, in the way he avoided looking at me directly, that made me feel like he was carrying something heavy inside. I didn't push him, but I couldn't help but notice the change. There was an emptiness there now that hadn't existed before. And as much as I hated to admit it, I felt it too. Something had shifted between us, something subtle, something unspoken, but it was real. We sat in silence for a while, the room growing colder with the absence of words. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. I couldn't take it anymore. My thoughts were running in circles, and I didn't know how to stop them. I stood up and walked over to where he was sitting, a strange impulse pushing me forward. When I reached him, I sat down next to him on the couch, just a few inches away. We didn't say anything. We just sat there, side by side, as if we were waiting for something to happen. And then, without thinking, I leaned my head onto his shoulder. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't something I planned. But as soon as I did it, I realized that it felt right, in a way I couldn't explain. For a moment, he stiffened, his body going rigid. But then, he didn't pull away. Instead, he relaxed, just a little, and I felt his warmth against me. He didn't say anything for a long time, and neither did I. The quiet hung in the air between us, thick with things unsaid. The only sound was the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. I could feel his presence, more intense than ever, but at the same time, it was like everything else had faded away. "Thank you for everything, Tom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he simply placed his hand on mine, gently. There was no rush, no immediate need to break the moment. He just let it linger, like he was waiting for me to say more, or maybe, like he was waiting for himself to find the words to respond. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice low and careful. "You don't have to thank me for that." I wanted to say more. I wanted to explain how much this all meant to me, how much he had come to mean to me. But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. In that moment, I realized how much I had come to rely on him. How much I needed him, more than I had ever allowed myself to admit. But I also knew something else. This couldn't continue. This couldn't go any further. The sound of the front door opening suddenly broke the silence. It was Mom, coming home from work. We both froze, startled, as she stepped into the living room. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room, searching for some sign of what had happened. Tom quickly stood up, stepping back as if nothing had changed. I stayed seated on the couch, my heart racing, unsure of what to do. Mom looked at both of us, and for a moment, I thought she might see it, the distance between us, the unspoken tension. But she didn't. She just glanced between us, sensing something was off, but not quite able to pinpoint what it was. "Everything's fine," Tom said, his voice steady, but lacking its usual warmth. Mom didn't press further, but I could tell she felt the change, even if she didn't know exactly what it was. She dropped her bag on the floor and moved to the kitchen, leaving the two of us in an uncomfortable silence. As she walked away, I realized that this moment, this strange, complicated moment, was the turning point. Things could never go back to how they were before. Not for me. Not for Tom. Not for any of us. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how to fix it or if it could be fixed at all. But I knew one thing for sure, my mom would have to make a choice. She didn't know it yet, but she would have to choose. Between me and Tom. Between what she wanted and what was real. And I wasn't sure who she would choose. I wasn't sure who I would choose.